Hello, and welcome to Courageous Conversations about Mental Health in Circus. I'm Janelle Peters, also known as CircusTalk, and I have the pleasure to facilitate these courageous conversations as part of an ongoing series with CircusTalk, creating space and time and bringing folks who are circus professionals together to talk about important topics in mental health, well-being, and systemic change in our field. All right, so we'll start with some introductions of our amazing panel. I'll go ahead and start us off because I might be the familiar face for folks who've watched the other episodes of Courageous Conversations about Mental Health in Circus. Still Janelle, still she and they. I am Circ-Psych, which is kind of the role that I'm in right now. So I am a mental health therapist in addition to being a circus professional, and I do a lot of work about holding conversations and trying to create space for conversations about mental health, well-being, and systemic change in circus. And that's what this is. This is episode 3 of this series. There are going to be 4 episodes eventually. If you've missed the first 2, you can go back in CircusTalk and find those. And now I'm going to go ahead and have our panel introduce ourselves, and then I'll circle back at the end and do my full introduction for myself. So I'll go ahead and have us start with Alec. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hey, I'm Alec Stoddard, and my pronouns are he and they. I'm an aerialist and a contemporary circus artist who specializes in chains and hammock and other looped things. And I primarily tell queer stories through my aerial performance art, and I'm writing essays examining the constructs that my work interrogates. The land on which I create is the historical and contemporary home of the Tongva Gabrielino people. And those are the folks who are the rightful caretakers of Tovangar, which is also known as Los Angeles, California. I'm a white trans masculine person with short cropped light brown hair, glasses, a septum ring, and I have tattoos that are coming up my neck.
Awesome. How about Nina?
Hi, my name is Nina Sawant, and I am a co-founder of the Dahlias, which is a cirque ensemble that I founded with 3 other Asian women. I am a choreographer, a costume designer, and in circus, I specialize in various different aerial apparatuses as well as sear wheel, and I bring my dance background into all of the work that I create. What else about me? I am a South Asian American woman, and to give you a little bit of a description of me, I'm quite petite. I have very long dark brown hair, and today I've got earrings that are geometric silver and copper discs, and I'm wearing a teal sweater. And I'm in a room that has a window behind me and then an orange wall with part of a mural on it as well.
Welcome, Nina. Ginger, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Ginger Snaps, totally my very real given name. I am a circus performer and instructor. I am a producer as well. I specialize in sphere and lyra. And I also run a program at my studio and as well as reaching out to other instructors and studios around the world about instructing plus size aerialists. I myself am a plus size aerialist. My visual description, I have medium length, curly red hair, poorly managed at the moment. White woman, lipstick, very freckly, fat, and a lot of earrings because I am a holdover of the 90s. And you can find all of my everything on gingersnapsburlesque.com or at gingersnapsburlesque on any social media platform.
Awesome. So now that you have been introduced to our esteemed guests, I'll follow up. So Janelle, she or they. I'm a white person. I've got chin-ish length, weird curly hair that's sort of a mohawk right now. I like have to look at my haircut to describe it right now. Don't know what's happening. Um, I'm a contortionist, aerialist. I'm a coach in both those disciplines. Like I mentioned, I'm a therapist. I'm your familiar host. You've seen me before here. And I am coming to you from the past, present, future land of the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne people, aka Denver, Colorado. And I'm really excited for this conversation. We are going to be talking about mental health and well-being for folks in circus in marginalized bodies. So that is the gist of the conversation. And I'll go ahead and get us started off with the first question. So sort of our icebreaker question, sort of our like general segue question, which is what originally drew you to circus? Whoever would like to answer can go ahead. We can kind of just popcorn it. Go for it.
I like how we're all waiting so we don't cut each other off and then just nobody goes. Oh, the fun of Zoom. I'll go ahead and start. I actually started out in burlesque, and through burlesque performance ended up working with a lot of local aerialists and shows and such. And they would just say, hey, you should come to our studio, try a class. And I have what I like to call the Lisa Simpson problem, which is if somebody says I'm not supposed to, or I'm not allowed, or I shouldn't do something, then I'm probably going to do it. So since there's always this assumption that fat bodies can't do aerial, I was like, oh, I'm going to go do it. And so I took my first class and struggle bust quite a bit. I creatively fell over for about 9 months before finally developing biceps, and the rest is history.
Is it better if I just call on people and you can just say pass if you don't want to answer this one? Or shall we just wait awkwardly for each other to talk?
Well, I was going to say I can follow up with that one
Great.
in a similar vein that I got into doing circus by being a fetish performer. So I was doing suspension bondage for like art events, and there were aerialists at these events doing like cube and sphere and stuff like that. And the performers talk to each other at events like that. And I was like, huh, that's really cool what you folks are doing over here. And they're like, that's really cool what you folks are doing over here. So we kind of started a cross pollination. And, that's what led me to taking aerial classes. And I thought that it was a really cool way to expand my physical repertoire, and to also give me control over my shapes in the air rather than the person that I was working with. So the rest is history.
Right, I guess that leaves me. So I first got into circus because I got laid off from my dance job in 2009. And I had been dating one of the acrobats on the show that I was on. And he was is still a Ukrainian circus performer. His name is Vitaly Krimsky. And he offered to train me in aerial so that we could perform together and eventually tour together. And so that is how I got into circus.
Awesome. Thank you all for sharing. I'm going to go ahead and read the next question. Throughout this conversation, obviously these things are all interconnected. And so if you need to circle back to a previous question or if there's a tangent, just go for it. It's completely fine. So the next question is, what would you like to share about your experience of marginalization in circus and how it connects to or how it differs from an experience of marginalization outside of the circus world?
Maybe you should just call on us.
Okay, Nina.
Can you say the question again?
Yeah, of course. So this is kind of getting into our topic, right? So what would you like to share? What do you want folks to know about your experience of marginalization in the world of circus, and also how it connects, so how it relates or how it might be different from your experience outside of circus?
So I find that my experience of marginalization in circus is it's really subtle because it's taboo to say like your skin's the wrong color for this part, it's not what I imagined, or things like that. Generally, like there are still some people who will say that, but it's not, you know, mainstream acceptable anymore to do that. But throughout my career, you know, and I think most people who don't happen to fit the default of, you know, for female bodied or female presenting performers, like 5'6" and a size 2 and probably white and with like ballet training kind of lines. If you don't fit that, you go into an audition and you don't know if you didn't get the part because of your skill level or your artistry, or if the person casting the role really had like not examined their bias and was like, well, this is what I pictured and you don't fit that. And as somebody who's mixed race, I don't like ever check anyone's boxes. Like if they're trying to like surface level have a diverse cast, like we need our, you know, Black performer, we need our like Latina performer, I'm not necessarily going to be the person they cast because I don't check the diversity box for them. But then also if they're like, well, you know, our main character is like this ingenue and a princess role or whatever. And so, you know, my gut just tells me that she's 5'6" and thin and white. I'm not going to check that box either. But you don't know that when you go into an audition. You only know whether or not you got a callback or whether or not you got the role. So I think it can be really subtle. And I think as performers, we already tend to kind of be like, I'm just not good enough if you don't get a thing. So you've got like kind of those layers of it of like, I'm not good enough, but also like, maybe I never would have been good enough. It wouldn't have mattered depending on who's doing the casting.
Thanks for sharing that, Nina. Alec or Ginger, do either of you want to jump in, or shall I call on you too?
Call on us.
Okay, Ginger.
Okay. So my experience was kind of odd because I knew when I started that I was not somebody who was expected to be in this space, but the people who invited me in were also the people that were running the space. So at the studio I was at Sky Candy, I felt very accepted, at least on the surface. When I did run into issues where I felt like I didn't belong in the studio, it wasn't something that was ever done intentionally by people there. It was usually things like people being very prescriptive in the way they would teach things. And for instance, saying like, okay, we're going to work on pike and tuck mounts under the bar on your lyra. And no matter how obvious it is that due to my body composition, that just won't work for me, it still was pushed and pushed and pushed. So I would feel very marginalized because nobody stopped to consider that they should be teaching alternative things other than what they had been taught to teach. And so I kind of grew in that position for a long time. And before a teacher finally was like, hey, let's figure something else out for you. And then it was a whole new world of, oh my gosh, that's right. I don't have to do what this sheet says just because somebody else gave this person the sheet and said, this is how you do it. As far as other outside of my studio, I definitely would get a lot of looks, a lot of kind of like poorly thought out comments from people who I was told I'm supposed to look up to. For instance, if they were like a guest instructor or somebody coming in to do workshops, and they would just literally look at me like, why are you even here? Like they were just surprised that I was there. And the weird thing is this has changed a lot. It's almost like now it's trendy to actually be aware of these things in circus. So the same people who were so dismissive of me in the past all of a sudden are frankly a little bit up my butt, and it's really weird. And like I want to be appreciative of that because yes, that's the direction we need to go, but the other part of me also wants to be like, yo, really, like you should have been this way from the start. And I mean, that's really not that different of an experience as far as what I run into in the outside world. Although in the outside world, it's always, you know, comments and this and that. I have a lot of like social media videos out there and things like that and interviews that make the rounds. And the comments people come up with are insane, and all the assumptions about your health and what you're doing. And I mean, I had one person literally just like look at one of my aerial videos and be like, why aren't you thinner? And I'm like, I don't know. That's a lot of questions. I often ask the same thing. So it just kind of feels like it's an all the time from all directions thing. But I am very much one of those people that really just makes me want to push harder at it, because at the same time I hear positive things from people, and I know I'm a good performer, and I know people like seeing that, and I think that they need to see more bodies like mine on stages.
Thanks, Ginger. Agree. Hard agree. Alec, how about for you?
Yeah, I hard agree on both folks sharing about, like, I like that, Nina, you brought up that it's a little subtle in um circus spaces, or that Ginger brought up that, like, once upon a time it was probably more, I don't know, acceptable, or wasn't unchecked, back in the day when some of us got started. And then now it's almost like, because of social media, because of conversations like this, people are starting to approach us, and we're kind of like, what is going on here? Like, growth. Yes, we love to see a growth. But specifically, for me, the subtleties are very much, like Ginger said, all encompassing. It feels like it's coming from everywhere at all times, and it's taking up a lot of brain space to have to do stuff like having to suss out every situation that I go into. If I'm figuring out a training space, or what coaches I want to work with, what festivals or conventions are safe for me to go to, what companies aren't going to be shitty, gigs, coworkers, like costume designers, anybody that I interact with in the industry, I'm trying to create a checklist and cross reference with other gender diverse folks, um, to be like, is this going to be a problem? And if it is going to be a problem, then having to, like, mitigate and figure out the level at which I'm going to have to deal with that problem, and if I'm willing to. It's sort of like I have to do like a risk analysis of, I really want to go learn this discipline somewhere that I don't have access to wherever I'm training, but I know that the people teaching it, or the people running the workshop or the convention or something, are gonna be a little, maybe not like openly transphobic, but they're probably gonna do some misgendering and maybe some like weird body comments while I'm working with them. And so, yeah, it's not like anybody's hate criming me outside of the studio, but there's all these, little things that are happening. Most of all, having to be like my own biggest advocate and educator, when people are like, well, we just don't know what to do. You know, I'm glad that we're putting out information like this that is packaged in a way that we're holding space to have these conversations, so that they are accessible to folks that are curious, that don't know, that are trying to grow and do better. But then it's like, the outside conversations outside of this space that we have created that aren't appropriate. I'm trying to train. I'm trying to work, where I don't want to have to be the educator, or the advocate in that moment. This is a moment I'm setting aside for that, but that's not everywhere that I participate in. And how that's different in the real world for me, I feel like, is I can be a much better chameleon in the real world. Um, I can wear a button-up shirt like I'm wearing right now, and I can, mask, my form and my figure. I can blend in a little bit. My voice is deeper, so when people interact with me in, like, the Muggle world, they're like, "Oh, this is a guy. Yes, sir. Here's your coffee order," and whatever. But if I have to get into a unitard and go get on a hammock, or if somebody's like, can you wear this topless costume? Then it starts to become very apparent that the body that you're looking at in this context that you're going to put on stage isn't just a little guy walking down the street. So so that's where I feel like the circus arena puts a tighter focus on, you know, me and my body.
I actually have a question, which is like, as somebody who costumes people, and this is a question for everyone. My gut is that it's probably better to be like, just address, you know, the thing and be like, hey, are you comfortable with this type of costuming? Or, you know, like ask questions rather than kind of, I know that I've found it really harmful before when I used to have a very large chest and I had a breast reduction. And prior to that, people would look at me and go, oh, you probably need the large. And like, I'd be standing next to somebody, I'm like 5'2" and I have a really short torso. I'd be standing next to somebody who's like 5'10" and they'd hand them the small. And we'd both be like, because they were making assumptions about both of our bodies and like, particularly as like a petite performer with like a lot of curves, I found that people didn't know how to address that, were like mortified about my chest just existing. And then we're like just trying to cover it up with anything they could with no regard to how that like, whether that was flattering on my body or how that made me feel as a performer. But I'm curious for really the three of you, Janelle, you as well, what is the best way for somebody who's working with you in a circus capacity to address some of these things that are often microaggressions, and then like just, you know, acknowledge the reality of what's going on?
This is something I feel like is a never ending issue that I run into, because you don't find plus size dance costuming. It's just not really a thing. And so I ended up learning to make my own costumes out of necessity. And I also have, you know, previously worked as a wig and makeup artist. So I deal with a lot of clients there where it's a similar situation of I'm going to do this thing that alters your appearance and I don't want you to be uncomfortable. So I always would ask people, tell me anything you definitely do or do not like or want to do. And costuming wise, like I always appreciate if somebody's like, hey, bring some of your favorite costumes, bring things you like. Even if we don't use it, at least then we know what you like and what fits you. And then we just go off of measurements. We don't talk about, you know, what size this is or that is. We just get down to it. Because it's the other thing is too, like larger bodies, we know we're larger. I know I'm fat. I'm not blind. I have a mirror. I costume myself regularly. So a lot of times using euphemisms or trying to beat around the bush about it just makes it even worse. And I've always had the issue of when I do a show, nobody costumes me well. And it's really frustrating. Like people that are professionals, they just look at me like, well, we don't know what to do with you. And so I always end up either having to amend and re-sew and rework costumes that they've given me, or just providing my own costumes. And it's everything from, you know, leotards to shoes to whatever. So yeah, I would just appreciate if people are like, just send me your measurements, tell me what you do and don't like, and let's start there.
Yeah, I love that approach of like it feels more customizable to ask that question of like what do you do and not like. And then the thing that I run into specifically working on looped apparatuses, especially chains, is that they will take your clothes off. Like if you're wearing a two-piece garment, if you're trying to do the like baggy shirt tucked into whatever with a waist warmer, just praying that that shirt's not gonna fly up, you know, training and stuff, like it's risky business on those apparatuses. And I find that as I'm costuming myself, like Ginger was talking about, because we feel like we have our own like vision in our head of like what we should look like on stage. And you know, and I'm trying to explore what that vision looks like and how it works with the choreography that I want to do on the apparatus that I want to be performing on, is tricky. And it's tricky for me to draw any inspiration from other performers, because I feel like if I look to like menswear costuming, if people picture an aerialist, a male aerialist in their head, he's shirtless most of the time.
Yeah.
And I'm like, maybe comfortable doing that, maybe not comfortable doing that. I think it depends on the context. And then it depends on like, what am I wearing in the rest of the costume and how does that look on the apparatus? And I feel like just that like customization isn't common. It's usually here's what we have. We think that you might be this size. And then there's a meme about transmasculine people's bodies, created by transmasculine people, where there's this little cartoon guy that's shopping for jeans, and he's like sadly paying for his jeans, and they're like all the way up to here on him, and then there's like a pool of fabric on the floor, and like, his booty is really big, and he's like, yeah, the fit's perfect. This is, yeah. And that's how I feel too, where I'm like, I understand that my body has different proportions than what we would expect for another 5'6" circus dude to be doing. And I'm aware of that in the regular world too, because if I go to Target and try to buy some pants, then they're gonna feel weird and kind of fit a little weird on my body. So yeah, I like the customization answer there.
I'm noticing a trend as we're talking, and I love that we've gotten so specific about like costuming and like bodies in particular and like how we show up on the stage. And I'm noticing a trend kind of in the conversation of not only are we engaging in circus, which like requires a lot of attention to safety, physical safety generally, but also as folks in marginalized bodies, y'all are having to attend to your social safety, emotional safety, maybe even also physical safety, relational safety, right? In a way that everybody here is talking about ways that we're proactively doing that. I ask these questions ahead of time. I make my own costumes, right? And that labor, that work of protecting our safety has all landed on the folks in marginalized bodies. And I'm noticing that I'm going back and forth between including myself in this group and not, and I'm aware of it, and we're just going to stick with it for now. But that work of keeping ourselves safe is landing on us rather than landing in our community or in our environment. And I want to use that like little linchpin to segue to the next question, which is like, how does that affect your sense of well-being and your mental health? And how do you work with those effects?
I'll start. So I, because in circus, I tend to find my marginalization to be a bit more subtle. I don't have to do quite as much work around that in my day-to-day. Like I can show up to a gig and for the most part, I know that nobody's gonna like, there might be rude comments, like misogynist sort of comments or comments about my body because people think they can do that when you're in a leotard or unitard, but they're not going to necessarily be inherently derogatory because I am fairly close to that default that people want to see. And so I have that privilege. But more recently, I've been like, having these conversations more and trying to find ways to actually unpack my own marginalization, because it was much, easier in some ways to just be like, oh, well, it wasn't good enough. And that's why I didn't get that job. Or that's why that person referred somebody else instead of me. And now I'm having to like really think about that and like try to figure out how to even talk about my own identity. This is the first, I think, public time I've called myself South Asian American because there's like not really a word for if you're like father is from India and mother is white. Like there's no like special term for that. And most of the ways I've found to refer to myself are a mouthful and sometimes confusing for people. So for me, it's mostly this sort of like self-exploration currently, and like figuring out how to acknowledge those things that really truly have affected my entire life and my entire career, but that I've been able to kind of ignore and pretend didn't exist for a while.
I often find that my biggest struggle is usually that I'm my own worst enemy with this, because I am constantly having to kind of deal with, comments and discussions and everything around my body. Like either it's somebody wants me to come be the chubby inspirational person, or somebody wants to make themselves feel better by, talking about my body in a context. And honestly, it's almost just like these flies constantly circling your head. And sometimes I almost find them kind of amusing. And I'm like, all right, flies, let's get together. We're going to have a learning moment. And other times I just want to swat the hell out of them. But the biggest problem is me, because I have such severe issues with just trusting that I am this person other people think I am. And I get nervous about the idea, for instance, of working with a coach. And are they going to look down on me because I've been built up by other people, but I can't do moves that are considered basic things for others? Or that I have these weird holes in my knowledge because someone just gave up on me at some point, and then I gave up on myself and was afraid to say, hey, help me with this basic thing. And so I really struggle to reach out and work to better myself because I have such severe imposter syndrome. So I've learned how to act confident and how important it is to portray that confidence, because I think it's important for other people as well. And they need to see me being confident for them to be confident, but I don't feel that way all of the time. So I have to do more work on convincing myself of those things as well.
I think that the overarching feeling is exhausting. And there's actually a term in the trans community called transition fatigue. And that's something I've experienced a lot of over the past couple of years. With the pandemic, the way that it has led to a lot of introspection on a lot of different social issues and understandings. And I'm grateful for, the time of introspection and like re-examining my relationship to circus and to my communities and the industry as a whole. But it's also, I'm tired. I'm real tired. And I think that, I'm having to learn how to balance the importance of my emotional well-being against the introspection, against the personal growth. And like Janelle, you were saying about, it sounds like the onus is on us to be doing a lot of this work. And I think that that actually plays into something that you shared with me once upon a time when I was putting all this pressure on myself, and you said, hey, that's actually something that the systems of oppression have set up and built into them, is that marginalized folks will learn to oppress themselves. And being aware of that and being aware that it doesn't have to be all my work is helping me come down off of some of that burnout and exhaustion and the transition fatigue, and being able to pace myself in such a way in the industry that I don't feel like I have to know it all right now and have all these skills developed right now. And because I'm very aware that if I'm doing what trans folks call stealth, meaning that somebody doesn't know my trans status, like if I'm training with someone or in space with someone, and I'm stealth to them, then they look at me and will make an assumption that like, okay, he looks a little weird, and he's also not doing the skills that we would imagine a guy aerialist to be working on, or like that I can't do yet because I'm still in the midst of transition and training, and I just had top surgery 5 months ago. So like I just got back in the air like a month ago. So I'm trying to let myself off the hook a little bit on some of this of like, trying to show up and appear as if I, you know, am what people like you said, Ginger, what people have like built me up to be, and just being a little more authentic with like where I'm at and giving myself permission to be tired and just show up in the ways that I can when I can.
Yeah, I mean, talking about the way that oppression and marginalization gets internalized, right? And how it becomes something that's just in the water that we don't even realize that we are perpetrating upon ourselves or others is such an important part of this conversation. Because Nina, like you named it right out the gate, you're like, well, people aren't going to just like outright say a very capital R racist thing anymore. And that doesn't mean that we're done with these conversations either. Um, and I'm also wondering about some of the tools or the places that all three of you turn when you are feeling that burnout or that exhaustion or that overwhelm, or when you do realize like, oh shit, I just found another layer of this within myself that I have to start to unpack. Where do you take that? Like, what happens for you around community and support or your spiritual practices? Like, what are we doing to care for our well-being and mental health in this context?
I mean, I try to just talk about it honestly, like as openly as possible. Like if I'm feeling insecure about something, it's almost like I'm also want to dare myself to say it to somebody else, because not only does that help get it off my chest, but I think it helps other people because I know other people are having similar issues. And I think it's important to share, like, like especially on social media, not everything's, glamour and sparkle all the time. Like I have a lot of these same struggles as well. So being able to acknowledge that both helps me and other people and makes those conversations easier. But I mean, ultimately, I also just have to sometimes be like, yeah, some days I'm just going to feel shitty about myself and I'm just having a bad day. And maybe my hypermobility is really acting up and my body really hurts. I'm going to cancel training. I'm going to stay home and get high and pet my pets. Like, that's what I'm going to do. Watch a movie I like, just like chill, like allow myself to have a break. And also sometimes just go back and like look at my pictures and videos and like remind myself who I am. It's like, I guess sometimes I worry that I get put on this weird kind of like soapbox pedestal because like, oh, a fat aerialist, yes, we need one of those. And I have to remind myself that it's not just because of the body I'm in, but I'm good at what I do with that body. And regardless of the size of my body, I can do beautiful, amazing things that other people can't. And other people, regardless of their body, can get value from me and my teaching and my performing. And so I have to just remind myself of that, just have like a Lizzo moment and be like, self, who the hell are you? Look through all this stuff, be like, yes, that's who the hell I am. And it's awesome. So yeah, I wallow in self-pity for, an hour or so, and then usually get over it.
I think I don't think I consciously did this until like the last few years because I didn't really picture myself as marginalized. And I still struggle with that. Like I filled out a grant application the other day and I had to like talk about that and like, questions similar to like what we're talking about today. And I was so exhausted afterwards because it really involved like examining some pretty traumatic things from like mostly more traumatic things like outside of Circus than within Circus. But I was like, wow, that takes even just like, this is a thing that's supposed to help me, that's like geared towards people who've had similar life experiences to me, but just putting that into words and like expressing that in a way that it's a weird feeling, especially like doing it like to get money from it is really a weird thing. And I found that I was really exhausted, and I haven't like found any surefire ways to deal with that type of exhaustion, but I have in the last week like purchased several new plants. So that I guess is probably how I'm dealing.
I love the plant purchases. Yes.
Yeah, I do
Yeah.
it too.
Nina, I love that you brought that up about the grants. Because when I started shifting my career, from being like a company-based, a gig-based performing artist and coach to being what I would consider more of a contemporary artist, creating work for like festivals and gallery, and like Rachel Strickland would say, it's the wanky artist sort of thing to do. I didn't realize that when I started that shift, and I felt the pull while I was still in a performance company, and I was still like, creating a new act like every month, and grinding out the new techniques and the creating new sequences and stuff, and I didn't feel fulfilled by that, and I knew I wanted to shift, but I couldn't figure out how to do that without money. Because like if you're in a company and they're costuming you and they're providing you training space and coaches and stuff like that, you're like, oh, I'm here and I'm like doing what I want to do, performing, but I also feel a little limited by the artistic vision of the company that I'm performing for. And I knew that I wanted to do more, but I couldn't figure out how to do it. So that's when I started like researching like grants and stuff like that. And if anybody's looked at the grant situation for the arts in the United States, that it's abysmal. And throughout the pandemic and a lot of the social change that has been going on over the past couple of years, we have seen an emergence of more smaller independent grants and stuff like that. But I started to feel, as I was researching those, kind of grossed out by a feeling that I'm now able to identify that they wanted me to perform my trauma in order to get paid for it. And I didn't want to do that, and I haven't done it. And thank goodness the whatever art beings in the world have shined upon me and said, here is your art community that you can plug into, that are also marginalized folks, and gain those resources there, because I didn't know how I was going to do that without having to put my trauma up there on a pedestal for other people to consume and then pay me for it. And I didn't like that feeling at all. So how I'm, working with this sort of trauma and harm now is I'm creatively and like purposely trying to avoid situations like that, balancing the understanding that there's going to be some points at which I need the money in order to fund some of the stuff that I'm doing. So I have to be selective about when I'm going to do that. And again, that's another layer of labor, to have to cross-reference, when am I willing to do this? And basically I've worked with this harm in making it my work. At the end of the day, I am working on it through the art that I'm creating, but I also feel like I'm creating like a historical record that maybe hasn't existed before, in marginalized folks in circus, like a record, a history that folks can look back on and go, oh wow, look at all this like stuff that went not that well, you know, like, wow, offering these grants to these marginalized people didn't quite hit the nail on the head where we wanted it to, you know, and just continuing the conversations on those things while also taking myself out of the grind. You know, if I need to take a break off of social media, I just won't post. If a project's taking longer than I expected it to because I've had to unpack complicated traumatic feelings, then I just let it take longer than it's going to be. And I'm, like I said, in a privileged position now where I can take the time that I need to unravel those things in that way. But that's not time that's afforded necessarily to other folks when they're like, here's your grant, this is the deadline, you have to be able to perform in this amount of time, and we want you on stage here, and like da 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 da. And it's like, I don't know, you enter a situation where you're like, I have to do the thing, guess I'm going to dissociate and just get through it, you know, and not actually deal with the harm or the emotions that are coming up through that work.
Yeah, I think like apart from plants, I think I forgot what my original point that I had started with was the work that I create, the creative work that I do. One helpful thing, you know, sort of about the grant application process is actually connecting the dots between like, this is what I'm driven to create, and actually like looking at why it is and who the audience for that is, and why that is. And so it's one positive side of having gone through the grant application process is realizing that my work is that way of dealing with it, of like, oh, I don't have like a place in the world, so I'm going to create one. My career has been like very independently driven. I don't get a lot of like big companies reaching out to me and being like, you're perfect, we want you for our company. Instead, it's like me creating the opportunities for myself. And so I think that's kind of the way that I've dealt with it. And then in the creative work, it's like, I love making imaginative things that don't fit into a particular existing storyline. And I think that's probably kind of me being like, there's no word for what I am, I'm just going to make one up.
I really appreciated what Alec was saying about when people want you to essentially perform your trauma, because I feel like I get put in that a lot as well. Because I know part of the reason some people want to work with me is because I'm in a larger body and they want, you know, either diversity points or they're aware that this will be appealing to their audience. But I will often find myself in situations where people want me to do a performance about my body, which is not at all what I want to do. This is actually a kind of an average body here. This isn't that unusual. And I get tired of people acting like it's absolutely crazy that there's a fat person doing these things. And, you know, there was one show where they wanted me to perform to Wrecking Ball. And I was like, I feel like that is a fat joke waiting to happen. And they're like, well, yeah, that's kind of the point, is we want it to seem like it's that, but you're actually really good. And so I was just like, no, I'm not going to. Like, if you want to acknowledge the size of my body, then we're going to do it in a positive way. And so I will either perform to Queen's Fat Bottom Girls or a Lizzo song of my choosing. Those are the options. And this casting person's like, well, I'll have to take it back to the producers. They may not want to do that. And so I just straight up told him, I'm like, you know what? You need me more than I need you. Good luck finding another plus size aerialist that's performing at my level. I'll talk to you in a few days. And sure enough, he goes to the producers. They're like, okay, sure, do a Lizzo song. I'm like, cool. That's how I want to do it. But even then, I am in a position of financial privilege where I can put my gig on the line like that. And most people aren't. And I think it's really frustrating that the only way I can provide that representation is because I'm financially privileged to do so, because of my husband having a quote unquote real job, not in the arts. So yeah, it's like what I always use as an example of what I want to see more of is If you look at Melissa McCarthy and the acting roles that she does, you will never see her do a film where her character, where her role is about her body. She does all sorts of films where she's a romantic lead or an action this or that. And she just happens to be in a plus size body doing whatever the thing that character is doing. And those are the kind of things I want to be in. I want to do the kind of performances and the kind of roles where I can express whatever I want or whatever the character is supposed to be without it being about my body. It's the same thing with any kind of representation. Like on television, it used to be, if you had a queer story on television, you had an entire storyline about such and such person coming out or whatever. And now we're finally getting to the point where somebody happens to be queer, or somebody happens to be trans, but it's not part of the storyline. It just is. And I really want to get to that position of it just being is like that.
Yeah, I think I've talked to other directors and people before who are like, oh no, we need to be diverse. Let's figure out how to do this. How do we check the boxes? And one thing that I always try to emphasize is if you're not a fat aerialist, you don't get to tell a fat story. It's not really appropriate for you to write that story. You need to, at the very least, be consulting with somebody who's lived that experience, and probably bringing them in to help you write that. And I think you kind of did that for yourself there, by being like, no,
Yeah.
I'm not gonna tell the joke that you somehow think is funny and appropriate that actually isn't.
Germans, what are you gonna do?
I think that this concept that we're working with, where we're talking about the marginalized folks telling our own stories, and that we don't want those stories to circle around our trauma and our harm, is a very important concept. It's an important theory that I learned about in my arts community here, in the queer arts community. There's a term for it. It's called survivance. And it's a term that comes from Indigenous studies. A cultural theorist named Gerald Visner wrote on it. And I first heard it in the context of queer survivance. And what they mean by that term is it's an active sense of presence. And it's specifically in opposition to victimry. It's sort of like the "we're here, we're queer" sort of chant and stuff, but it's that level of visibility where we're in charge of what our image looks like, we're in charge of what our stories look like, and we don't want to tell the trauma stories. So that's actually something that I'm working with in my work too, where I'm it's not that I'm refusing to tell the marginalization stories, or refusing to talk about the harm, because obviously there's a place for that, so that there's some advocacy and understanding, but I don't want it to be the whole story. I don't want it to be a one-dimensional look into my life or my art, or I feel like trans folks often get criticized for being one-trick ponies, where they're like, well, this is all you ever talk about, and this is is being trans your only interesting thing about your personality? And it's well, you made that the only interesting thing about my personality, because you're the one that's looking for those trauma stories. If we look at the headlines in our society at large right now, it's all about really awful things that are going on for trans folks, and then directly under that is the fight that folks are doing against it. But there's more to it. There's more to that experience. There's more to our presence than that we don't quite get to, because we're too busy up here in this harm reduction area, that we don't get a chance to talk about or experience what what being trans and just being like a whole three-dimensional human being really looks like.
Alec, you are segueing into the last question really perfectly, and I'm loving hearing from everybody, like, what am I doing? How am I working within this very complex, difficult situation of like needing money to do my work, but wanting my work to not just be about the grant application that like relies on me like performing my trauma. And the next question is what, and I'm gonna like change the wording a little bit, put a little finer point on it, because everybody's speaking so perfectly about like what you're doing. What do you need from the circus community and the circus industry? So originally it was phrased as like, what changes need to happen in the community or the industry to like prioritize the well-being of like all artists? But I want to change it to like, what do you need from the community?
That's a good one.
As we're all like, if we could just get anything that we wanted from
Money,
like,
just more money. No.
Yeah.
But I mean, and we can be
Let's
really
do it.
frank. Like we can speak really frankly. I think in a conversation like this, it's easy to get real theoretical. I know I do it. Alec, I know you and I talked about doing this, right? But we can be really concrete because oftentimes the experience of marginalization is that concrete physiological and safety needs are not being met, right? Like what do we actually need?
I mean, I feel like it's from so many different directions, because I've talked about this before, but I mean, I feel like we need to approach it both from a what's being put on stages sense and what's happening in classroom sense. And it's this huge thing. Like, first and foremost, I would need to see more bodies like mine and more diverse bodies in general on stages. You know, I want what's on stages to be a reflection of what is out in the world, not just one type of body. And that right there is such a huge part of it, because other people going to these shows and seeing bodies like theirs on stage gets those people to go, oh, hey, this is a thing I can do. This is a thing I'm allowed to do. And then they pursue it and they can go to classes and they can try it. And I need studios to be welcoming and reach out to people and let them know that they are welcome there. I need them to not have weight limits. I need them to talk about weight and how it plays into aerial in the FAQ section of their website, because plus size bodies are really concerned about that and are looking, am I going to get my feelings hurt? Is somebody going to say something terrible to me if I go to this class? So they're reading your website. They're looking for that. I need that to be on the site. And I need them to say, no, unless you could be 1,000 pounds and we can get you on an aerial apparatus, you know? I need that to be out there. I need it to be in people's advertising. I need people to be less prescriptive in the way that they teach and the way that they level up students. I mean, frankly, it needs to be an entire overhaul. I just feel like that it's other bodies are not being considered. And that can be anything from a plus size body to maybe somebody missing a limb. Like, there are so many options out there. I feel like we need that creativity. I need people to remember that this isn't just look at me doing a series of moves on something, but it's an art form, and helping people figure out how they can express that and how they can take what may seem like a hindrance and turn it into a positive aspect or a jumping off platform for developing new things and putting that on a stage so somebody else can be inspired by it as well. I could be on this soapbox forever, so I'm going to stop.
I totally agree with you. And like I wrote out some like little bullet point answers to this question when Janelle sent it. And one of them was like, I need the industry leaders in the circus industry to be actually representing diverse bodies on stage. Because if, you know, like I know multiple people who've like auditioned for Cirque and been told like, oh yeah, you're really talented, but like, we just don't have costumes in that discipline that would fit you. And they're like, they're pretty close to that, you know, default size. Like this is a very narrow window of like, who will fit the costume.
Lord knows you couldn't make another one.
Right, and like, you have so much money. You have corporate sponsorship. You can't make another costume.
Yeah, get Joanne Fabrics to sponsor you. Like, come on.
Right? And like, that's such a weak excuse now. Like, I mean, I don't know that it was ever not a weak excuse, but now like you have things like, if budget is really an issue, then like have your design sublimation printed onto your fabric instead of having it hand airbrushed. Like, I'm an artisan, I love handwork, but like, if you're using that as an excuse to not make costumes for different sizes of bodies or different shapes of bodies, then that's like, no, screw the like the handiwork, and like do it in a way that you can actually functionally costume and consider more people for those roles. Because on the kind of other end of the spectrum, I primarily, when I'm acting as a producer, it's for like corporate events, where I have zero buy-in from my audience. So like my ability to push the limits of what they want to see, what they're expecting to see, because they're not expecting to see us at all at a corporate event. We're like this fun additional thing. So that audience is like, they haven't bought a ticket to see this show. So if I put something out there, if I put a performer out there who is too far outside of what they're expecting, I'm probably putting that performer like, I'm going to probably put them in a harmful situation, because they might be more likely to hear, you know, a negative comment from somebody. They may even hear it directly from them. They may even hear it from the client. Sometimes clients are awful about things like that, and will be like, that performer doesn't look how we expected them to, and we need to replace them, or something like that. And so if like our industry leaders are doing the work of saying like, hey, we actually have a lot of power here. People are buying tickets to our shows. People are fans of our shows. We are the people that they think of when they think of circus. And if they're willing to actually have diverse representation, that will affect the entire industry and make it more acceptable, so that there's audiences have a wider perception of what an aerialist looks like, and what, you know, any discipline in circus looks like. And if they're not doing that work, then like everything we're doing at our small individual level is like, we are running, you know, uphill in an oil slick, like because the larger audiences are not going to start accepting us as much. You know, and obviously that's a complicated like thing with a lot of factors in it, but I really want to see our industry leaders doing a better job of this, and like really being even just open to like considering more than just this very one particular body shape and size and you know, genders. And like, I have friends who've been told that like, oh yeah, I mean, you're a good clown, but like women aren't funny, so we don't cast them as clowns. And it's like, what? So yeah, like I think that's, if I had to choose like one thing I need, it's our industry leaders to do better.
I think that, again, very good points. I think that everything feeds into each other, and that theory, I can't escape it, that there's like, it's circular, because Ginger's right that there is gatekeeping happening from the moment someone wants to step into a studio and even consider being a circus artist. You know, they haven't even made it to the stage yet. And then there's, you know, gatekeeping from the back end on stages too, so that leads people to not want to step in to the studio or try to step into the studio because they've never seen themselves on stage. So both ways are blocking access to folks that could really elevate and, you know, progressively change contemporary circus, but we're not giving them the opportunity to. So this answer gets convoluted, because I agree that like folks who can put their money where their mouth is do have a responsibility to try to you know, address some of these barriers to access, and that involves them swallowing this fear that whatever they do to change studio policy or to, cast diverse folks and put them out there in the world, that somebody's going to come back and say, we didn't like that. We didn't like, you didn't do enough with the studio policy, or you didn't, you know, give us the exact representation that we wanted. Like, we got to be willing to make some mistakes here. We got to be willing to make some mistakes and continue to have conversations, because we just had a conversation about how the way that grants have been realized recently aren't quite hitting the note that we want them to be hitting, but that doesn't mean that they're a bad thing. So I think that people get frozen in indecision land, where they're like, I want to do something and people are calling on me to do something, but then they don't do it because there's this fear that it's not going to be received. And that is also the fear of it not being received by the audience, and the audience not being able to see things and like gain an exposure to what those artists are capable of doing, are both feeding into each other and keeping us from, you know, actually putting folks out there in the world as artists. Because I know that, like Nina, you brought up, like in the corporate work situation, like I would be uncomfortable, like if somebody were like, go do this gala here for like this GE or whatever, and like it's going to be a very champagne cocktail, whatever thing, and we're going to have you like bass somebody and perform topless and whatever, and I'd be like, people are going to have a feeling about what I look like on stage doing this. But I don't know the exact answer of like how to influence the world at large requires our influence within the industry, but the industry is afraid of what the world at large is going to see.
Yeah.
Honestly, I call bullshit on that industry fear, frankly. Like, I think it is an excuse. I think that when you are dealing with a population where 60% of the population has something about them that is larger bodied or different colored or all these different things, why are you assuming that they're not going to like seeing themselves on stage? It's just not true. And it really frustrates me when people use that as an excuse. The people who don't want to see that on stage, frankly, fuck them. They're not in the majority. They aren't. They simply aren't. Change your audience, help your audience learn to do better. I mean, frankly, it is that simple. And it just, yeah, like I use myself as a microcosm of that example, but I've been voted the best burlesque performer in Austin for the past 5 years running. And this is the entire city. We're what, like the 11th largest city in the country? Like, people of all sorts vote on this. And one of the number one pieces of feedback I get from audiences is that they love seeing somebody that looks like them performing on stage. And that's really important. Like, that is, I feel like, an excellent example of what you're going to find in other places. And frankly, Austin's not even that diverse. So if we can do that in a city that frankly is losing people of color left and right and is in the middle of frickin' Texas, then I call bullshit on people in other positions being able to do the same thing. I think they're using that fear as an excuse, and I frankly feel like they just need to get over it.
Yeah. And I've seen that reflected in like the fashion and beauty industry, where like, it's like, oh, well, we don't sell plus size clothing because like, there's just not that big of a market for it or whatever. And like
60%, that's not enough of the market.
Yeah. And then also with like skin tones and makeup, and you see brands like Fenty and they're like, oh, you didn't think these shades would sell?
Mm-hmm. Well, and Rihanna's done that too with her lingerie line. Like, Victoria's Secret is dying. They are like on the biggest downhill slope right now because everyone's buying Savage X because she's making awesome stuff for all sorts of different bodies.
Yeah. And I think the same is going to be true in Circus, is that like when our like, I think at all levels, and I'm seeing a lot on like local stages, and I think, both of you have spoken to like, if anything, sometimes feeling tokenized in those smaller productions. But like there is that effort being made. There are those like risks being taken of putting diverse bodies on stage. And if that starts to happen at those larger company levels, you know, like Cirque and Seven Fingers and Circus and all of those companies, like that's, you know, going to be the equivalent of having Savage X come through your Facebook feed, and it's starting to change the way people see lingerie and who they think is supposed to wear lingerie. Seeing diverse bodies on all types of stages is also going to shift what a circus performer is supposed to look like or supposed to be capable of, or, you know, those sort of things.
Also, we don't need to talk about how much money I spend on Savage X.
And kind of, I love that Ginger was like straight up bullshit. Like this, I'm calling bullshit on this.
Yeah.
And I agree with you, and here's why. From a trans perspective, because there are less trans individuals in the audience. I'm not saying there's no trans individuals in the audience. I'm not saying that, you know, everybody shouldn't have a like relationship with what their gender is, whether they're trans or not. And that we shouldn't be having those sort of conversations. But I have plenty of folks who aren't trans that look at my work or like engage with the questions that I'm asking of my audience and stuff and say, I'm so glad you asked these questions. I'm so glad you put this out there, because this is something I think about myself too, or this is like, you know, helping me understand how I can be more vulnerable in my practice, you know, and stuff like that. So even if it doesn't have anything to do with being a trans person, people still get something out of it. So I think that on that level is too also bullshit.
Yeah.
I'm noticing that we're getting close to the end of recording. Are there thoughts that are little stragglers or connections that we want to circle back to? What else do we want to make sure gets said while we're here?
I think I had a straggler thought. It was kind of related to what Ginger Snaps said about having like the list of things that somebody needs to be capable of in a classroom setting and those sort of things. And I, you know, transparency, I have not spent a lot of time taking classes. I did mostly like independent coaching and training. But I know that like there are a lot of auditions I just won't go to because they're like, oh, well, you need to be able to do X number of this skill and X number of this skill and X number of this skill. And it's like conditioning things. It's not like anything you would ever perform. Mm-hmm. And I have never in my life done like a leg lift, like touch your toes to your hands without assistance. I've been an aerialist for 13 years. So if that's one of the requirements in an audition, then like I will never get past the first round. So I don't bother to go. And I look at it, and this might sound a little bit like arrogant, but I'm like, I know I'm a pretty good artist. I've had a successful career for 13 years. So like, if your only metric is like conditioning, like unless the act is literally doing leg lifts, why is that your audition? Why is that what you think people need to be able to do in order to do that role safely? Especially when then I go and see the show and I'm like, why did you
when you go and see this? Yeah, it's like level 1 stuff. Like I go to a Cirque show, I see somebody that I know has not trained as an aerialist wrapping themselves into this little like preparing for a foot hang on the ground, and then someone pulls them up and swings them around.
Yeah,
like you took somebody who clearly has athletic skill, taught them this basic thing, and then you did all the work. Like, and that's like that is literally 80%. At least of most Cirque shows. Like I usually will see one act where I'm like, okay, these people are legitimately trained aerialists, and everyone else gets into a shape and gets swung around.
Well, and Nina, I'm fully going to be that person, but I have performed with you. You are an excellent aerialist, not a like, oh, not very bad aerialist. So that's important to say too. But something I've been thinking about a lot and working with clients about and kind of like bringing into some of my Circ Psych work is we have this idea in circus, and this is also really common in the dance world, that we have these high standards, we have these high expectations. And reframing that is actually we have some pretty specific standards and some pretty narrow expectations, and that they're not actually necessarily high, they're just specific, and they actually come from white supremacy culture and ableism culture and like cis heteronormativity culture, right? And so it's such a helpful way to think when I'm thinking about like our asks, right? We're asking studios to do better, we're asking industry leaders to do better. That do better can be to examine your standards and to really ask yourself, is this a high standard or is this an arbitrary standard? Is
Yeah.
this a high standard or is this a racist standard, right?
Yeah.
And that question can happen inside your own head, so it's not as vulnerable, and then you can work from there, you know? Um, but I think especially with regards, you know, to what you're talking about the leg lift, we think like, oh yeah, like if you're a good aerialist, you can do more conditioning things.
Mhm.
And that leaves entirely out what you're bringing to the stage as a person, which is really what we're talking about here is like our physical human forms in our work, not
Yeah.
needing to adhere to these really specific standards in order to be valuable and meaningful and for our work to be meaningful.
Yeah, and Veronica Blair, who runs the Uncle Junior project and is an amazing aerialist and choreographer, circus choreographer. She hosted a talk in the summer of 2020 about, and it was for people of color in circus. And one of the things that she, like one of her kind of ending points in the talk was specifically for Black aerialists who often struggle with not conforming to these like European ballet ideals of like line and toe point and things like that. Instead of trying to reach those ideals, like looking at your own body and recognizing the strength and beauty in what you already have and seeing what's capable, what your body is capable of, rather than comparing it to and trying to like achieve this external sort of idea of what it looks like. And as a creative person and as a choreographer, I'm like, yeah, oh my God, like I want to see bodies do things that only their body can do. That like, you know, and I come from dance training, so I do default to, you know, like arabesque lines and ballet hands and pointed toes and all that sort of stuff. But like when I see a performer who doesn't do any of that and is captivating because they're fully like in their bodies and have explored all the ways that their body moves and have made choices as to what they think is going to be most interesting and expressive in the way that their body moves, that is like, I will watch that all day. Watching somebody like do an arabesque, I'm like, great, I've seen a million people do that before. That was a pretty arabesque. And so I love the idea of shifting into like valuing that individuality, which I think is one of like circus's greatest strengths. Like we don't generally have like a corps de ballet where like everyone needs to be the same height and lift their leg the same, you know, angle and whatever. Which like that's a whole other thing to examine, but like in circus we don't often do that because like a contortionist is going to have different lines than an aerialist, than like a porter, than, and we value that in our shows, having that variety. So like lean into that further and like not just the specific roles of this skill, you know, has this discipline has these skills and this aesthetic, but like this individual body is doing these skills and is doing them in a way I've not really ever seen before because they're using their body the best way that they can.
I think that ties into the what do you need of the industry, and I'm really glad that Nina and Janelle, you spoke to that you know, right now for me, I'm like, I need like coaches or artistic mentors and stuff to approach me as a person and not a body. Not a body that you're going to force meat hook technique upon, or like, you know, like how to get my body to do something that you think it should be doing in this discipline that I'm asking you to train me in. um i I think that, Nina, you're right. Like that's what makes folks captivating as performers and artists, is seeing them as a person, seeing them inhabit their humanity on stage is captivating to audiences and they appreciate it. And I've heard people say that, and that's a way that gets us out of this prescriptive narrow fields of vision of what we think a body on stage should be doing or looking like.
Yeah, I've judged some aerial competitions, and one of the ones I did, they did make a point to speak to, like, we're not necessarily looking for, this kind of toe point or the this or the that, and being careful of those. And so the way I always approach it, and what I tell my students is, I'm not saying you have to have, these specific lines or pointed toe or this or that. What I need to see is intentionality. I want you to figure out what works best for you and what you're trying to express, and then commit to it and fully do that. So yeah, I don't want to see a floppy foot just because you forgot to engage it or you were focused elsewhere. But if you're like, I like this shape where my knee is bent and this foot is flexed, awesome, do it. That's not my aesthetic. I am very much the look at my pretty lines and pointed toes and grace, grace, grace. But I can appreciate other aesthetics and other people when they are fully doing it and putting it out there.
Yeah, I think we need more space for folks to be able to explore that, because it's at least in my experience, I haven't interacted with a lot of training spaces or coaches, but I have sought out folks who are specifically like, yeah, man, you want to get weird? How weird do you want to get? Okay, what was the intention behind that movement? What story are you trying to tell here? Can we make this a little bigger? Can we make this a little smaller? And like, those are the sort of folks that I'm trying to work with. And I would love to have more of those people that are like invested in my development as an artist and not invested in me trying to thwack my foot on my head or
Yes.
hold my planche with someone hanging from my neck.
Yeah. Like, I always want to get weird. If someone's like, this might be weird, I'm like, yes, that's what I want to hear. Tell me, like, make it weird. Like, I personally, like, as an artist, I find making your audience uncomfortable is actually one of the best things you can do. Like, from the burlesque standpoint, I call it the awkward boner. Can you make someone be like, oh, I'm attracted to this, but also very uncomfortable? I'm like, that's the sweet spot. I love to be in that spot, and I love to encourage other people to get into that spot. Make people question things, make them uncomfortable. That's part of your art.
Yeah.
Well, actually, does that get people to examine their biases? Does that get people to examine the stuff that we're asking them to examine as a society if we're not making them uncomfortable?
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like the superpower that everybody has brought to this conversation is having already done so much examination of yourselves, of your industry, of your community, of your work, of its meaning, all of this, and like our ability to do that and to bring that to other people, on the stage or in a classroom or in a, panel on CircusTalk, right? Like, is the way that we are bringing about these changes that we're asking for and that we're working toward. I want to be really respectful of everybody's time. I know that we had a set time to finish and we are past that time. But I do want to have folks go around and just share where people can find you, where people can find your work, how people can support your work, so that anybody who's watching this episode is able to seek all three of you out and keep following what you're up to. Ginger and Snaps, will you start?
Yeah, my website is gingersnapsburlesque.com, and I am on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, all at gingersnapsburlesque. And you can support my art by hiring me, have passport, will travel. I love to travel and perform and teach workshops, both student facing and staff facing. Yeah, I would like to get out and be on my soapbox in person more often, so hire me.
Nina, how about you?
You can find me on Instagram. My handle is a little bit funny to spell, but it is _NINAUIU_, or you can just search Nina Sawant. And so follow me there. I also have a Patreon with the same I think that one doesn't have the underscores. It's just NINAUIU. And similar to Ginger Snaps, hire me. I'm a performer. I'm also a choreographer. I love creating new things for people. I love traveling and performing. So yeah.
Go for it, Alec.
Yeah, and my website is real easy, just alecstoddard.com. And on Instagram, I'm at Alec the Aerialist. I'm starting a Patreon as well, to house some of the more long form conversations that don't quite fit on the pithy social media sites. So you can find me there. It's just Alec Stoddard. That's going to be launched in May. I don't know when this episode comes out, so maybe it's already May. Maybe you can bop over there and find me. Maybe it's not live yet. But yeah, that's the best way to support me now, is if you head over to the Patreon and sign up and just want to be involved in the artistic conversation there.
Cool. Thank you all so much for being here, for your time, for your energy, your vulnerability, your humor. Huge thank you to CircusTalk for making this possible, and thank you to everybody who's watching or listening, for being here and for being part of this. And please reach out to these three and hire them in the future, and just let's keep this conversation going. It doesn't need to stop here.